Hello there and welcome. Today we talk about expanding horizons of cross-cultural interaction. Not my phrase, the title of the last chapter in our textbook. And as we should know by now, Professors Bentley and Ziegler very much emphasize this kind of thing, trade and other types of cross-cultural exchange between peoples around the globe. So, in some ways, this chapter kind of pulls a lot of pieces together, or attempts to, and I'm presenting it that way myself. We'll see some ways in which that is so as we go along. But it might help you to remind yourself that this has been a major theme all the way along. There's been some earlier chapters in the book that were, uh, if not solely, mostly about cross-cultural exchange, trade. Right, the Silk Roads is a vehicle for trading not only goods but religious ideas back and forth, ideas about technology, etc. So I'll start with a quote from our wonderful, lovable authors. Travelers embarked on long distance journeys for a variety of reasons. We're talking about roughly from the 1000 to 1500, it says at the top. Nomadic peoples range widely in the course of migration, so nomads, people who do move regularly, and campaigns of conquest. East European and African slaves traveled involuntarily to the Mediterranean basin, Southwest Asia, India, and sometimes even southern China. Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim pilgrims undertook extraordinary journeys to visit holy shrines. Three of the more important motives for long distance travel between these years were trade, diplomacy, and missionary activity. The cross cultural interactions that resulted helped spread technological innovations throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. More or less what I just said in somewhat different wording. World long distance trade, circa, that's what the C stands for, about 1200. So you see a map here that does not include the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, and that's because no one that lived in this part of the globe you see on the map knew it even existed yet. So the Western Hemisphere had not been linked through any kind of cultural connection yet. That doesn't come until the voyages of Columbus and other Europeans that followed. There were possibly some, we don't know too much about this, but there's possibly even likely other European explorers that got to the New World, North and South America, before Columbus did, but they didn't leave much of a mark if they did. As I'm sure you already know, Columbus's voyages set in motion events that radically, drastically, in many ways, tragically uh, altered the course of events and changed cultures in the Americas. Um, a quote from a really good book called Power and Plenty about world trade uh, says something about this map. Janet Abu-Lughod, in a book from 1989, a noted scholar in this field, a really good book from a really good book, has presented a vivid picture. So this is another author, Ronald Finley, uh, talking about this other scholar's work. So she presented a vivid picture of a non-hegemonic or horizontally linked world system. We'll get back to world system, what that means, from 1250 to 1350, which covers essentially seven whole regions. The links extended in successive steps all the way from the British Isles and Spain in the west to China, Korea, and Japan in the east, and from Bergen and Novgorod in the north to the Indonesian archipelago in the south. Although only items with a high ratio of value to weight, such as spices, silk, furs, and slaves, were traded over long distances, there were fairly extensive regional markets for bulk items such as grain, olive oil, and timber. The physical and institutional infrastructure to support this trade in the form of transportation and credit systems was also well developed, and travelers such as Ibn Battuta, more on him later, Marco Polo, more also on Polo, and various papal envoys showed how relatively easy and safe it was to cover enormous distances. So again, in a way, our authors have been preparing us, I have been preparing us for this eventuality right here. We've talked about long distance trade before, but this is indeed long distance trade, as you can see from the map, all the way across the Eurasian continent, and at least halfway down, and actually further in some cases, the continent of Africa. And so this is a big chunk of the world now that is interconnected through trade, and trade lanes, sea lanes, roads like the Silk Roads, which are still around, and exchange of all kinds of things, as we shall see. What does it mean in the first sentence there when Abu Lagod talks about non-hegemonic or horizontally linked world system? Non-hegemonic means that there wasn't one power like China that dominated sort of the trading system, and that it did end up being a system, meaning it's interconnected and it sort of works. It worked sort of all together, not all the time, but overall, this was an interlocking and essentially cooperative system of trade. And that's not to say that there weren't some military conflicts or violent conflicts in there. It's saying sort of in general, this system was horizontally linked. There wasn't a dominant figure in it per se, or that made the rules and called the shots. There were no rules, but it sort of worked out to be kind of unofficial rules. That's why it could be seen as a system. And calling it a world system is certainly not totally accurate, since it leaves out the Americas, but it's pretty close at this point. This also, I think, gives us some reason to stop for a minute. I forget if this has come up in the class or not already, but this type of system, in this case, a system of interaction between peoples. There are different kinds of social and cultural systems you come across in studying the world, society's history, but this type of system is a particularly interesting one. What some have called, usually coming from the field of economics, a spontaneous order. Not so much order as an organized, that's kind of what it means, but an order means sort of like a system. So we can use it as a synonym, I suppose, here. So what is a spontaneous order? It means a system that's created that, sort of a system implies and means that there's sort of a working together. So within these lines that we see here, the geographical area we see here quite widespread, that it's almost as if this was sort of put together ahead of time by design. Like, okay, we're going to have a trade route here. We'll build a road there. I'll see that. I'll go from here to here, and this will connect to that. And like a handful of bureaucrats or civil servants somewhere sat around in a room and planned this all out. But the word spontaneous order, of course, doesn't lead in that direction. What this is saying is a spontaneous order means is that a system that works out like this, that's a spontaneous order, it looks as if it has been designed, but it hasn't. It's evolved over time. And this is what makes such systems so amazing, is that how could something just sort of happen without anybody planning it? And yet on the other side, looking back on it now, in our case, it looks as if it could have been done by design. This looks like it could have been constructed, and yet it was not. So spontaneous orders they're kind of all over the place in history and in societies, really. Sometimes the development of legal systems, for instance, looks like it was planned out, but actually you find that it sort of was put together piece by piece, just by people acting, doing their part in a larger system, a larger order, and it sort of they're not thinking at all in many cases about the larger whole of the system, or that it's a system at all, but that's what it becomes. So this is a good example of what is often referred to, as I said, as a spontaneous order. And in fact, I will say this, one last comment on this. Spontaneous orders, I think, oftentimes have been shown in history to work better than systems that are put together by planning. That's not to say that any kind of spontaneous order doesn't eventually get some laws and some rules attached to it by people in power. It's just that they're kind of tweaking it and improving it, and reforming it, but they didn't create it. It's a kind of a natural evolutionary creation, and then people kind of tweak it here and there to make it better. That certainly happens, and that certainly happened here, even in this order or system we're talking about. But that tends to work, I think, better in history than when things are created out of whole cloth. When systems, large-scale institutions, whatever it may be, are created from just the human mind and have never been done in practice, it seems to work out better when these kind of develop naturally. That's also not to say that everything that sort of develops naturally is good or worth keeping, of course, because you may have already noticed this when thinking about it in the last few minutes here, that slavery could be seen as a spontaneous order. So slavery as an evil institution is, and system is not one that we'd want to keep, and didn't keep, at least in our part of the world. So not all spontaneous orders are worthy of keeping just because they evolved naturally and weren't planned. But I think some of them are, and this is probably a good example of one that fits into that category. One further comment on this, I'm making more comments than usual on one quote, but this kind of gives us some foundations to move further in this presentation. So what did we mean when we talked about certain items being traded over long distances, and only such items as spices, silk, furs, and slaves that had what the author here calls a high ratio of value to weight? Well, the point being that it's not cost effective to take products that weigh a great deal or have a huge mass to them over long distances, I think, for obvious reasons. So the things that tended to get traded the farthest away, at least some of the time, were things that were highly valuable but fairly small. And this one isn't on there, but think like diamonds. Right? Diamonds are the perfect thing if you're a trader, a merchant, and you're trading things all over the world. They're the perfect thing to sell overseas or in these kind of long distance systems, because they're worth a ton, pardon the pun, right, for just every little small little nugget. So one or a little baggie of a handful of diamonds is worth trading all across the world, because there's so much monetary value in a tiny amount of mass or bulk. So it makes sense that they're in such a system. Merchants are going to try to economize and have to think about costs, and it's just not cost effective to trade huge, extremely heavy items. You can't put uh, 12 ships in a baggie and send them overseas to sell somewhere else. So a high ratio of value to weight. A pretty simple concept, but one that I think we could have easily glided by and then not seen what was being said or meant. Marco Polo, one of the most famous traders and merchants of this period, maybe of all time in some ways. He traveled from Europe, a European, Italian, and went all the way to China and back again by the rather crude route. Not that the route was crude, but the map is crude, way that it's laid out for us here, and spent 30 years. He actually went with his family. His family was an Italian trading family, so he was there as a young man. But what sort of causes us to focus on him for a minute here is that he wrote about his travels and wrote essentially a journal, and it's become famous. It's a tremendous primary source document, sort of one of the great pieces of writing. One could call it travel literature in a way, but his family was there on trade. And he brought back a great deal of information about China and India and Asia as a whole, as well as goods that Europeans fell in love with. Now, he wasn't the only European to do this, but he's the one that wrote that wrote it down, in a way that survived to become an enormously influential account, and brought back products that became enormously influential along with the account. So, as another author says about Polo and his influence, his historical significance, perhaps no one did more to bring the splendor of China to European consciousness than the Venetian traveler Marco Polo from Venice. Europeans had visited China before Polo and after, but his travels remain an all-time classic. I should say his travels. I should have put that in italics because that's the name of his book. That's what it's referred to as today. A major building block, the book, in the rise of Western awareness about the mysterious Orient or Asia. Like many European and Arab traders who had preceded him or them, the Polos had no pretensions of being anything more than merchants seeking their fortune in a fabled land of silk, jade, and porcelain. But 24 years later, the Polos returned with tales, meaning returned to Europe, about the East that forever altered European perceptions of the world. So that's where the real historical significance of Marco Polo comes in. Brought back products that were somewhat known before, and so he contributed to a degree to get Europeans addicted to such things like silk, jade, and porcelain. That's true, but even bigger, the writing and the publishing, the spreading of his the knowledge that came from his travels, the book, uh, uh, forever changed the way Europeans looked at the world that they lived in. It sort of broadened their horizons, as we sometimes say, and started to understand, hey, the world is not just Europe, and there's a lot of other people that have a lot of different ways of doing things and thinking, etc. Rabban Salma, not as sort of well known, I think, at least to Americans, as Marco Polo, and long distance diplomacy. Our text does talk about this, and in fact, Bentley says in 1287 the Mongol Ilkhan of Persia planned to invade the Muslim held lands of Southwest Asia, capture Jerusalem, and crush Islam as a political force in the region. In hopes of attracting support for the project, he dispatched Rabban Salma, an historian Christian priest born in the Mongol capital of Kanbalik, but of Turkish ancestry. So that's quite a lot to say, but Salma was a pretty complicated, had a pretty complicated background. As an envoy to the Pope, so he was sent to negotiate with the Pope and other European political leaders. Rabban met with the kings of France and England, the Pope, and other high officials of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is an example of, again, long-distance trade sometimes being used for negotiations, sending an envoy, diplomat, an ambassador from one place to another, in this case, very far away. We know that already from a previous unit on the Mongols that they were quite good at conquering far and wide. So this was preparatory to an invasion of the Middle East, in which the Mongols were seeking to find allies, so kind of feel out the Pope, feel out other European kingdoms to see what their reaction would be, and if they might not be, sort of brought on as allies in attacking the Middle East. In the end, the mission didn't actually prove fruitful, for the Ilkhan, at least in terms of gathering European allies. But nonetheless, it's a good example of the way in which the world is being drawn closer and closer together through these intercultural connections and in various ways. Ibn Battuta, another very famous person involved in the process of shrinking the globe through increasing connections and travels. From Bound Together, recorded previously, on a hot June day in 1325, 22-year-old Ibn Battuta set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So he was a Muslim going on sort of the expected pilgrimage to Mecca, the holiest of holy sites in the Muslim world, that turned into the world's longest tourist trip of the epoch. I like the way the author phrases this. When he left for Hajj riding a donkey, he did not know that the journey would last 30 years and that he would return home only after traveling 75,000 miles. Battuta was no explorer, but curiosity about the world made him one of the world's first tourists, certainly the most famous. Writing an account of his travels, his description of the society and economy of many of the non-Islamic lands, especially those of the Mongol Empire, remains an invaluable resource. No medieval traveler, Eastern or Western, who left a written account of his journeyings can compare with it. So this sort of is up there, maybe equal, maybe superior to what Marco Polo did by sort of writing an account of his own travels. Batuta went certainly further around the globe, and so his writings about the travels were of immense value when published and read by other people. The map there is rather small, but you can at least, I think, gather that he basically went from all the way from east to west and back again, about the entire span east to west of the Eurasian continent. So this guy got around indeed, possibly the greatest traveler of all time, with the question mark because I say possibly. Long distance cross-cultural exchange and the global demand and supply of sugarcane. So our text also gets into sort of how certain crops and products, manufactured goods, were spread along these increasing lines of communication and travel, trade connections, trade routes, etc. in this world system, at least according to Abu Lagod. Muslims, according to our beloved author, Mr. Bentley, were instrumental in the continuing diffusion of sugarcane. They'd been involved in it for a long time before we're picking this up here. Muslim merchants and other travelers had begun large-scale cultivation of sugarcane in Southwest Asia and North Africa during the Abbasid Caliphate, just going back. After the 12th century, Muslims facilitated the westward spread of sugarcane by acquainting European crusaders with crystallized sugar refined from cane. Up to that point, Europeans had little access to refined sugar, and they relied on honey and fruits as sweeteners. They immediately, I think the reason is obvious, appreciated the convenience of refined sugar. Italian entrepreneurs began to organize sugarcane plantations on Mediterranean islands such as Sicily, Cyprus, Crete, and Rhodes. And if we were going further in this class in time, and you may already know this, of course, they would also take Europeans as a whole, not just Italians, would in time take over islands in the Caribbean Sea when they get to the New World, and turn them into sprawling sugarcane plantations as well. So sugar became a world, global trade product almost overnight. Humans appear to have a genetic sweet tooth. So if you feel guilty about eating things that are bad for you all the time, like me, and love sweets like me, the good news is it's probably natural. It's probably ingrained in us. That doesn't mean we can't fight it and diet and exercise and all those things, but it does appear to be built in. Lots of calories. Think back to our hunter-gatherers coming across a honeycomb. They already knew when they saw that hey, we eat this stuff and we'll be have a lot of energy for a long time, and it tastes really good as well. So that appears to have been built into us going all the way back to prehistory. The sugar trade, of course, had deep social and economic implications as well. I'm only going to name the biggest one, and that is it fueled the demand for slaves and slavery, which came from the African or Atlantic slave trade, but also from the Muslim slave trade. So slaves were taken against their will, of course, from Africa, in both directions, from Africa to the New World, the colonies of Europeans there, as we know, and the other direction, which we may not know as much, from Africa to the Middle East and beyond, into the Middle East and Asia in the Muslim slave trade. So it wasn't just Europeans, and the numbers were maybe somewhat larger in the slave trade that went to the New World, that went to North and South America, but not by that much. We're talking about millions and millions of people going in, again, by being captured by force, coercion, taken against their will in one direction or the other. long-distance cross-cultural exchange, and the global demand and supply of gunpowder weapons. So I'm not doing anything creative here because our author uses first sugar and then gunpowder weapons as sort of his main examples of this kind of vigorous long-distance trade going on in this era and beyond. Guns, gunpowder weapons of various sorts were invented in China around 1200, assisted in its spread, the technology itself, assisted by the vast size of the Mongol Empire. This is we already mentioned when we talked about the Mongols in greater detail, one full unit. But the fact that the Mongol Empire at one point anyway was so widespread, it in itself facilitated trade and connections between East and West. Not that was the goal of the Mongols, but it worked out that way in one of the many important unintended consequences in history. Bentley again saying that by the mid-13th century, gunpowder had reached Europe, and Europeans had begun to experiment with gunpowder-fueled rockets. But the early 14th century, armies from China to Europe possessed primitive cannons. Gunpowder technology as a whole rapidly spread across the entire Eurasian landmass. And you can see sort of a bit of it sort of here in the map, at least showing us sort of the time and sort of the directionality of weapons being traded sort of to and fro. Long-distance spread of disease and the Black Death of the 1340s. This, of course, was the largest outbreak of bubonic plague in not just European, but in world history, though there have been many outbreaks of bubonic plague in the ancient world, the Middle Ages. But the big one was what's referred to as the Black Death. It hit Europe in 3 years, 1348 to 1351, and wiped out about killed off. Wiped out, I guess, is a bit vague. It killed about 1/3 of the population of Europe in 3 years. So we certainly know something about these days about the spread of disease and what it can do around the world in a pretty short amount of time. But this was, imagine 1/3 of the population being lost in 3 years. What that does to a civilization, a society, economically, politically, psychologically, culturally, and on and on and on. So just absolute sheer devastation. A similar percentage probably killed in Asia, maybe slightly less, but about 10 million died in China alone, not quite in the same narrow time period as in Europe, because the Black Death, this outbreak of plague seems to have started in southwestern China, and so about 10 million approximately, because we're never going to know an exact number, died in China. So this wasn't just a pandemic that affected Europe. It was one that affected much of the world. The people in China, Europe, everywhere in between, had no idea, of course, how and why this happened. And not surprisingly, their explanations, when they came up with them, oftentimes were based on supernatural causes. In Europe, Jews were often scapegoated. It was said that they poisoned the wells. Whatever they put in the wells was poison, and that's what was causing this kind of mass, illness and death. Sometimes they blame themselves. God is punishing us for our sins, etc. You can see how desperate they were to find some way of explaining this without science at that point to really be able to help them at all. The plague was sort of equal opportunity in every place because it hit the rich and poor alike. The rich had somewhat of an advantage in avoiding a slight advantage, because they oftentimes owned residences, in various places and in the cities and in the countryside, so they could, go to their country retreat and be away from at least most people and have a smaller chance of it spreading. But there were plenty of rich and famous people that in Europe and China that were laid low and killed by the plague. An English princess, daughter of the King of England, was on her way to Spain via France to meet her betrothed future husband, and she was like 15 or 16 years old, and died at a port city in France of the plague. So it was equal opportunity in many ways. Norman Cantor, one of my favorite historians to quote in this class, as you know, mostly from his book Antiquity. Now we get to, and we have in the last couple of units, his work on the Middle Ages, which is his specialty. Recently deceased, great writer and historian, one of the best, says in a book on the plague. If you're interested in the Black Death, the bubonic plague, In the Wake of the Plague by Norman Cantor is the best book to read. It's a short book. It's a fairly easy read, and it's utterly fascinating. And he says in that book, the Black Death was the greatest biomedical disaster in European and possibly world history. Its significance was immediately perceived by the wise Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, writing a few years later. Khaldun says, civilization, so Cantor is now quoting a famous person from the time period, or just after. Civilization in both East and West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out in the entire inhabited world. Khaldun probably said it more eloquently and succinctly than anyone could, and that was written again centuries ago. A contemporary Florentine writer, meaning from Florence in Italy, referred to the exterminating of humanity. He did exterminating of humanity. He said it exactly that way. This was already seen at the time, before they had data and numbers to back it up, that this thing was widespread, and it was absolutely devastating, crushing. Causes of the Black Death, we of course know now. They didn't know then that it comes from bacteria, the one listed here, which lives on fleas, who then bite black rats, and it gets spread to humans when black rats, say, jump off of ships that came from one place and lay anchor in another, and black rats sort of jump off the ships if and when they get onto land. And the fleas sort of jump off of them, and the fleas start biting people, then those people are in serious trouble. So it actually comes from fleas, then to rats, and then to human beings. However, it then, and this is when it really, of course, got bad, the plague was then transferred from person to person in different ways. So it's one thing if it can be transferred, sort of in the first ways from animal to animal, or animal to people, but then when it could become transferred from people to people, person to person, it becomes a much more serious consequence for humanity, as we well know, sadly, from recent or fairly recent events. Consequences of the Black Death, not, again, shockingly here, people worldwide seem to be, sort of death, influenced. Death was sort of on everybody's minds. You see it in the art. Some selections here, not so fun to look at, but nonetheless, they were preoccupied with death. Cantor, again from the same book, the dance of death, macabre skeletons rising in mass from murky graveyards, was a favorite motif of art and literature in the century following the Black Death. It also caused, not shockingly again, long-lasting pessimism about life and society, the world. On the other hand, ironically, it brought a sort of golden age, particularly to the poorer people, the peasantry, small farmers. Most people were small farmers worldwide by that time. So in the century that followed, a good example of how could it be a golden age if everything's so pessimistic now and they're afraid of this happening again, which they were. One of the reasons is that supply and demand for labor was turned around. So high wages became the norm on the other side of the Black Death. Why? Because the labor force is now much smaller because everybody's died off. And big landowners that need lots of workers for their wealthy farms now have a harder time finding labor, so they have to pay more. So the supply and demand between worker and boss was turned around in favor of the worker. Now, no workers, I think, would have been willing to pay the price for that. Well, and I guess if they didn't care about their ancestors, they might have been. But nonetheless, another unintended, in this case, positive consequence of the Black Death. That's not to say that anybody was, as I just said, or should be now, glad that it happened. We're not saying that, but it did sort of turn out to have some benefit on the other side. Again, unintended consequences and important ones are rife in history. But eventually, civilizations recovered, and the two main ones that our text focuses on, which I think is appropriate here, are China in the east and Europe in the west, if we take Europe as a whole. And there is some reason to take Europe as a whole here, because though there were separate kingdoms and countries by this time, nation states in Europe, there were features of the culture that were uniting, mainly in Christianity, though the Protestant Reformation happens sort of around this time, towards the end of our time period here. Nonetheless, Christendom and sort of the culture that sort of existed around Christianity did sort of make Europe, in some ways, a homogenous block of countries, and it makes for sort of good compare and contrast material between East and West, because if you take Europe as a whole and China as one kingdom, China is so big that the two units are roughly sort of similar in size, population and territory. Again, if you take Europe as a whole, so this is fairly common for historians, world historians, to sort of look at it this way. They'll compare not England with China. That would be a mismatch in favor of China because of its size. But if you compare Europe to China and vice versa, then you have sort of more equal grounds of comparison, and it's more illuminating. The dynasty in question here that sort of shows the first signs of recovery after like 100 years from the Black Death is what becomes the spectacular Ming Dynasty. And its first emperor, first Ming Dynasty emperor, Hongwu, as Bentley says, immediately set about eliminating all traces of Mongol rule and establishing a government on the model of traditional Chinese dynasties. So, like the dynasties you've studied already in this class, like the founders of several earlier Chinese dynasties, Hongwu had little interest in scholarly matters, but he reestablished the Confucian educational and civil service systems to ensure a supply of talented officials and bureaucrats. At the same time, he moved to centralize authority more tightly than ever before in Chinese history. The Ming emperors insisted on absolute obedience to the policies and initiatives of the central government. They relied heavily on the mandarins, a special class of powerful officials, and also turned to eunuchs for governmental services. This quote is to say that this dynasty is the first one to kind of get China back on the right track after the devastating effects of the plague and other problems, and sort of refocused and kind of recentered Chinese society, and sort of brought back in some ways the glory days of China, which probably seemed gone forever for a long time. But China makes a gigantic comeback here, partly because of the ability of Hongwu and other subsequent Ming emperors who had sort of the vision and the understanding of what needed to be done, though again they had lots of history before them as lessons to sort of go back to. So going back to the Confucian educational system, the civil service system that for a long time before had sort of provided very talented bureaucrats and kept China sort of at least a very stable, secure, law and order based society, and even if it was done sort of the hard way from a lot of top down authoritarian rule, which it certainly was. The Mandarins were sort of, in a sense, from noble families most of the time, and kind of this privileged class who were, heavily represented in the halls of power as high-ranking officials and advisors to emperors. The eunuchs, which I think we mentioned in an earlier unit because it wasn't a totally new practice, and it's never pleasant to talk about this, but the eunuchs were castrated men, which we've seen as not just specific to China; it happened in other places as well. But they often became important bureaucrats and advisors in their own right, uh, partially because, and maybe mainly because, as people that couldn't reproduce any longer for obvious reasons, they weren't as much of a threat to emperors. The mandarins who did marry and have children for obvious reasons, or could for obvious reasons, were more of a threat because they could pass on their wealth and their power to their offspring. But a eunuch can't do that, so once they die, you can replace them with another eunuch, and it's not going to be sort of long-term power, at least in any one family. This is the main reason that they, sort of rose to power, and it was the main reason that the emperors, put them in power. Over time, the mandarins, and I think I did mention this before, but the mandarins and the eunuchs almost became like two kind of separate political parties who advised the emperor and staffed the Chinese, administration and civil service. Sometimes rival political parties. In fact, we'll see one momentarily, one sort of issue that they totally oppose each other on. In Europe, recovery looks somewhat the same. We start to see the rise of centralized nation states, but maybe the most outstanding feature, the one that again stands out the most, is the Renaissance. Bentley, yet again, says demographic recovery and state building efforts in Europe coincided with a remarkable cultural flowering known as the Renaissance. The French word Renaissance itself means rebirth, and it refers to a round of artistic and intellectual creativity that took place from the 14th to the 16th century, and that reflected the continuing development of a sophisticated urban society, particularly in Western Europe. Painters, sculptors, and architects drew inspiration from classical Greek and Roman artists rather than from their medieval predecessors. Meanwhile, Renaissance scholars, known as humanists, looked to classical, also Greek and Roman, literary models and sought to update medieval moral thought and adapt it to the needs of a bustling urban society. So the Renaissance, with its just outburst of creativity and geniuses like Michelangelo, you see in the lower left, his famous Last Supper painting is extremely, it's incredible painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling in the Vatican in Rome, but he's just one of many of the unbelievably brilliant artists produced during this period. But the reason that I put this on the screen is that I think it's not likely to see this kind of cultural flowering, the Renaissance or something like it, happening, if Europe was still sort of mired in, the after effects, the negative repercussions of the Black Plague. This is a sign that Europe was recovering, at least by now, on the other side of the plague itself. And as it says in the quote, the thinkers and artists and people of the Renaissance, and the period here, roughly 1300 to 1500, tail end of the Middle Ages, they weren't wild about the Middle Ages itself, which they were kind of, they were kind of the inheritors of the Middle Ages and medieval worldview, and they overall rejected it and thought there's really nothing of value that's come out of the Middle Ages. 1,000 years of history. We want to go back to the Greeks and Romans, who we thought had a better sense of the good, the just, the beautiful, the good life. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc. I think they were actually wrong, to be honest with you, and we've already seen, I hope, that the European Middle Ages did have something sort of worthy of inspiration, which would be rediscovered by later Europeans, but not the Renaissance. thinkers and artists just at the tail end of the Middle Ages. Chinese maritime reconnaissance and the expeditions of Zheng He. This is incredible, and in some ways, it's one of the great. This and the next slide show us one of the great what-if stories in all of human history. But reading from a quote that comes from a very famous historian's book on this subject, between 1405 and 1433. 7 formidable flag-waving expeditions ranged the Indian Ocean under Admiral Zheng He. The scale of his efforts was massive. The first expedition of 7 was said to comprise 62 junks of the largest dimensions ever built. These are huge warships, one of which you can see in the picture there. 225 support vessels and 17,780 men. The vessels, to judge from a recently discovered rudder post, justified the odd terms of contemporary assessments, displacing perhaps over 3,000 tons. This was 10 times the size of the largest ships afloat in Europe at the time. 10 times. So what's being said here, and it's clearly true, is that China had the most sophisticated, large, high-tech, potentially, devastating if you had to fight against it, fleet of warships in the world. Much more impressive than anything Europe had at the time. So this sets up our what-if question, from the next slide, which is European maritime reconnaissance and exploration of Atlantic Indian Oceans. Coming from yet another book on the rise of merchant empires in the world. He talks about Vasco da Gama's voyage, more on that in a second, and that of Christopher Columbus, who I'm sure you know about. One a Portuguese mariner, Columbus an Italian working for Spain. In Columbus's voyage in 1492, this set Europeans on a path to global unification through the rise of merchant empires. The transformation of Europe from a lesser civilization perched on the western point of Eurasia into a cluster of empires brawling for domination of world trade is widely held to mark a turning point in world history. And I think that's correct, that around 1500, around the time of these two voyages, this marks a gigantic turning point in history. Da Gama's voyage is famous because the Portuguese had been exploring the coast of West Africa, trying to find a sea route to the Indian Ocean trade, which wasn't just about India. It included Muslim merchants and Indonesian, Chinese, Vietnamese merchants. It was the center of the world economy and had been for quite some time. Europeans knew it. They knew they were out on the edge. They were sort of a backwater, and they were trying to get to the center of the world economy. And they already knew it was there because they'd done overland trips, Marco Polo's included, that showed them how lucrative the trade was there, how much wealth there was to be had in the Indian Ocean trade, Chinese merchants, Indian, etc., again, Arab, Muslim, but they wanted a better way to get there. Overland routes are more cumbersome, take more time, and you have to pay off middlemen. If you're going through the Middle East, for instance, or even the Italian city-states from, say, Spain or Portugal by land, or Italy by land, you're going to have to pay a cut to anyone's territory, any kingdom that you go through. So they're trying to cut out the middleman, Portuguese that is, and the Spanish, by going around it, finding a sea route. So go around the guys that are going to want to tip you upside down and shake your pockets full of any coins that you have. I mean, that figurative, of course, so it probably happened too. And the Portuguese finally find the southern tip of Africa after virtually a century, with voyage after voyage, inching further and further down the West African coast, with da Gama's voyage in 1487 and 1488. I shouldn't say that, I should amend that. It was a voyage 10 years earlier by another Portuguese sailor, ship's captain named, now his name escapes me, Bartolomeu Diaz, who first found the Cape of Africa And then 10 years later comes Da Gama's voyage, which knew where to go now, and rounded the Cape, and was the first Portuguese fleet ever to arrive in the Indian Ocean and then start the process of the Portuguese forcing themselves into the trade in the Indian Ocean. And they did force themselves into it. Columbus, of course, comes along and starts trying to sell an idea. He's probably a salesman more than anything else, and a good one. But what he sold was the idea that since the world is round, and all educated people already knew that it was round at the time, it follows that you should be able to not only sail east and get to Asia, you should be able to sail west and get to it as well. Though he said, should be able to, because nobody had ever done it by going to the west before, and the Portuguese were only in the process of going east to do it. So he finally found a taker in the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, famous in their own right, after trying to apparently sell it to England, France, Portugal, and he got no's there. So Columbus was like a door-to-door salesman who finally got a bite in Spain. When the King and Queen of Spain realized they didn't have to finance the voyage out of their own pockets, they could get investors to do it. It really was sort of a win-win for them, even if if Columbus failed, it wouldn't be any loss to them. Other investors would take the loss. So there's really no reason not to let Columbus try. And of course, he succeeded, sort of. And of course, I say sort of because he didn't achieve his actual objective, which was to get to Asia. He was trying to get to China and India and Japan. Which he knew about, and his logic was correct. You should be able to sail west and get there. What thwarted him was a piece of land they tripped over called the Americas, and he thought he was in Asia, and he made a number of voyages afterwards, back and forth to the New World and back, and always claimed that he'd found India, hence the name Indians for Native Americans. But Europeans, other than Columbus, realized quite quickly as word came back about his voyage and others, European colonies that began to be set down by first the Spanish, then the Dutch, the English, the French, etc. in the New World, the Caribbean islands, then North and South America, the big landmass continents, just ringing the Caribbean Ocean, that they were in a new place. They weren't in Asia. But it ended up actually being better for Europeans because by taking territory, and we know they took a lot of territory and set off mass suffering and death among Native Americans in all parts of the Americas to the tune of millions of people killed, most of it through diseases that Europeans brought, not intentionally per se, although they were happy to see them devastate Native Americans, believing God was behind it, of all things. So they were perfectly happy to see it happen. They didn't know exactly why. They attributed it to God must be on our side because he's killing off Native Americans, and most Europeans, or at least many Europeans, are living with the diseases that they bring or that they all catch. And of course, the reason for that is that the Europeans, as newcomers to the Americas, were bringing diseases that they'd built up a tolerance to in their systems. But Europeans were being wiped out. I'm sorry, Native Americans, Indians were being wiped out because they had no immunity built up to such diseases and microbes themselves. So through what some historians think of as genocide, I guess there's no reason not to think of it that way. But also, some of this was through warfare, enslavement of Native Americans, brutal treatment of them, murder of them, complete negligence in sort of dealing with them, fueled by racism and the idea of European superiority, ugly ideas about Europeans thinking that they're superior, including Columbus, but he wasn't uncommon. It was sort of the norm to think that way, as hideous as it is. But in all these ways, disease, warfare, etc., the populations of Native American cultures, north to south in the Americas, were decimated over about 100 to 200 years. and the Europeans carved out, these big New World empires. The Spanish one, you can sort of see little red blurbs there, which is a big chunk of both North and South America, and they extracted primarily gigantic amounts of gold and silver that made Spain the richest and most powerful country in Europe, possibly the world, for quite some time. This is, of course, all done on the backs of the suffering and forced labor, slavery of Native Americans, enslavement of them. And other European countries basically followed suit, including the English, put down colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, which eventually became the 13 colonies that rose up in rebellion, fought the American Revolution, and started the United States of America. So this was a major turning point. This is why it says in the quote that this is a major turning point, in all of world history, one of the most important ones. This is really what turned Europe from being a backwater, sort of, a relatively unimportant part of the world, an afterthought to the real players, mainly China, to sort of starting to turn that around. And within a few hundred years after these initial colonies laid down by Spain and other European powers, that situation was turned. And it became the center of the world economy, went from the Indian Ocean to being located in the Atlantic between Spain or between Europe and North and South America. And Europe became then the center of the world economy, sort of moving into the modern world, and up until this particular time period. So what about our what if question? Well, let's go back. The Chinese government, an emperor, not an emperor named Yongle, a later emperor in the Ming Dynasty, made a fateful decision. After the fleet was built and had made 7 voyages, it was clear that it was, formidable, but expensive to maintain. And the Chinese had lots of obligations, and one of their other major expenses, which had been ongoing, for far longer than the fleet had existed, were the continuing, ongoing threats of invasions and raids coming from the barbarians, as they thought of them, from the north and the west, nomadic peoples, right, that had been invading China for a long time, and it was costly to defend against them. Either put up defenses like the Great Wall, send out armies, or just to buy them off, all of which were done at times. And so there was a debate at the emperor's court, and this is where we bring the mandarins and the eunuchs back into it. And basically the conclusion was we can't keep both. We can't really afford to do both. We're going to have to either put our money ongoing into the fleet and maintain it over the long haul, or scuttle the fleet and put money into continuing defense against barbarian invasions, the traditional enemy. And one side, the mandarins said we should do one, and the eunuchs said we should do the other. And the emperor, in the end, decided that the best course of action, though that's arguable, of course, was to keep the money focused on defending the frontier against nomadic, barbarian tribes. Again, barbarian was the word that the Chinese themselves used for these peoples. But this, of course, could be seen as fateful because the fleet was just allowed to go away. Ships just sort of rotted in ports, and mothball fleet. And so the what if is, what if China, the emperor here, had made the opposite decision and maintained the fleets, again, going forward, since it was the most powerful fleet in the world by far at the time. So if that fleet had sort of been in the Indian Ocean when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1487 and 88 and came into the Indian Ocean with guns blazing, is it possible that the Chinese fleet would have blown it out of the water and ended Europe's sort of attempt to expand its influence around the globe just as it was beginning, or at least give it a major setback at the outset? So we'll never know because it didn't happen that way. But it's one of I think the biggest and most fruitful what if questions to contemplate. So this ended up, I think, being a possible major fateful decision for world history in terms of who called the shots in the future, European countries or China or somebody else. And of course, because the fleet was scuttled, it gave the Europeans an easier entree into the Indian Ocean, and maybe then allowed all this to happen that we see and already talked about here, and what follows, which is just growing European wealth and power. So it is, I think, always interesting and fruitful to ask that what if question. What if the Chinese fleet had sort of stayed? One further question, and then we're done here. But why didn't the Chinese fleet, while it was still in existence, try to make it to do kind of a reverse Columbus and sail across the Pacific to the east and to see if they could get to Europe? And why didn't they trip over, North and South America and discover it? Discovery in quotation marks. Uh, uh, well, I think the biggest, because the fleet surely had the capacity. If Columbus could take his little ships and get to the Americas unintentionally, the Chinese surely could have done so. I think it's motivation and the idea of incentive. The Europeans had the incentive to outfit bigger and better sailing ships and fleets and have better navigational technology, compasses and astrolabes to get them further and further away from home, because the incentive was to get to the Indian Ocean, the center of the world economy, and make a lot of money and increase European wealth and power. Well, the Chinese already were the world economy. They were already at the center of action. They didn't have a perceived need to really go far and wide. The Europeans did. So I think the real answer to this is a simple one, and that is the Europeans had an incentive to send ships, around the world or far across the globe, and the Chinese didn't. They were where they needed to be already. But in the end, you could say it actually hurt them to not have that motivation, because if they had, let's say the world economy already was centered in Europe at the time, and the Chinese had built that big fleet and then sailed it and got to the Americas first, that also might have changed the course of world history as well. So kind of another sort of secondary, A and B what if question here about the Chinese fleet and Chinese power going forward. Thank you.